As you look at the title of the lesson, you might be thinking, well, that's kind of a gloomy topic. But I don't think it has to be. And I hope that the things that we learn about it today will make us not gloomy, but hopeful. I heard a story about a preacher a long time ago who was preaching a lesson about heaven, and he was very pleased with the way the lesson was going, and it looked like the audience was very receptive to the things he was saying, and so he made the statement as he was preaching, if you want to go to heaven, raise your hand. And everyone raised their hand except one fella in the back. And so after the sermon, as people were coming out, he asked this fella, he said, now, you didn't raise your hand when I asked if you want to go to heaven. Why would you not raise your hand? And he said, well, I want to go to heaven, but you look like you were trying to get a busload up to go today. And I've thought about that through the years. In fact, when I've asked people, how are you doing? And they'll say, well, I'm alive, so I guess that's better than the alternative. But I wonder, is it? It's all a part of your perspective, isn't it? I want us to think about what Theron introduced for us in the reading, and that is death, the day of death. It may sound like a gloomy topic, but the fact is, it is a certainty in life. It's something that we can bank on. If you were born, you're going to die. The only exception to that is what Paul mentions in 1 Thessalonians 4 about we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord. If the Lord comes while we're still living, that's the only exception. Other than that, we will die. And so I think it makes sense for us to think about that fact. The Bible says a lot about it, so obviously it's something that God wants us to consider. And the Bible also talks about the fact that what precedes death, it should be viewed in a particular way as well, and that is that our lives are short. The longer you live, the more you realize that, don't you? Now when we go out to eat and I see these couples with young kids, I say, wait a minute, what happened? That was just me. What happened to the time? It's just flown by. And the other day, I was down in the ditch weed eating, and I looked out of the corner of my eye and I noticed somebody had stopped on the road. It was Don Rogers, and he came over and he wanted to talk a little bit, and it reminded me the very first time I met Don Rogers was when we moved here in 1999, and Owen was 4 years old, and I had put him on a riding mower and was letting him make laps back and forth in the front yard, and Don Rogers stopped, and he was just standing there looking at my son. I was brand new to town. I thought, now who is this guy? And so I walked over to him and I said, can I help you? He said, no, I just wanted to look at that sweet baby riding that lawnmower. And I thought, well, I think I want to know this guy. And that was like yesterday. But it was 20 years ago, nearly. Time flies by, and that's what the Bible tells us, is that we need to understand that. In 2 Samuel chapter 14, the duration of our life, our entire lives, let's say we live to be 90 or 100 years old, that entire time is described as water that's spilled. Now, how long is that going to be around? You spill some water, not there very long, is it? It just happens so fast. In 1 Chronicles 29, our entire lives are described as a shadow. You know, and that's something that isn't around very long, is it? In fact, we were trying to find a shady place to wash the car yesterday, and what you notice is that the shadows keep moving. And when the sun gets in a certain place, there's just not hardly any shadow at all. And it's just constantly going. And the thing is, do you have any control to bring that shadow back? Once that shadow's there and moves on, you're completely powerless to get it back. Job talked about his life, and remember, Job was in a situation where he could really reflect on life. He'd lost everything. His health was deplorable. And when you're in a situation like that, you're very focused in your thinking. And as he describes his life, the days of his life, one thing he reckons it to is a weaver's shuttle. That the things pass through, the parts move, it all happens quickly and it's over. He also talked about in Job 9 that his life was kind of like one of these messengers, or a runner that you would give a message to, and his job was to go as fast as he could to his destination. And Job said, that's kind of what my life's like. It's flying by. And then in chapter 14, he describes it as a flower. And, I can remember the very first time I got my wife flowers was, before we were married. And I thought, wow, I'd really done something. And in just a few days, I hope those flowers didn't look like my love, because they look pretty pitiful. And that's the nature of a flower, isn't it? It's just here for a little while, and right away its beauty starts to decay, and then eventually it's just completely gone. The psalmist in Psalm 78 talks about life being like the wind, that it's just passing by. If you've been outside the last week or two, we've experienced some weather that's not oppressive, temperatures in the 80s, but what's been really refreshing is that wind almost has a little cool to it. And if you're out there and you're hot and you feel a little bit of that cool wind come by and then it stops, it makes you realize how much you enjoyed that. But now that wind's gone. There's no getting it back. Psalmist in Psalm 90 describes life as a sigh. And it's over. Just like that. Now when you're young, in fact, if I was 12 or 13 years old here today listening to this sermon, this probably wouldn't mean much at all to me. Because I think, yeah, that's an old guy talking about how fast life goes. But it takes forever for my birthday to get here. You can't relate to this when you're young. But it's the truth. I'm telling you it's the truth. And now I've lived long enough by the grace of God to know that it's the truth. It's like the grass. You notice we had a bunch of rain there for a while and how beautiful the grass was. And I mowed the yard before we left last weekend. And when we got back, that beautiful green grass was brown and brittle, just from a few days of no rain. And it's just broke off and gone. And James talks about our life being a vapor. You ever sit and watch the steam come from your coffee cup? How long do you watch it? That one bit of steam that comes out, how long is it there? You better look quick, hadn't you? It's kind of like going through steel. You better look quick. It's going to be gone. Bible tells us that life is short. If you live to be 100 years old, it's short. And what sometimes seems like long periods of time for us, like when you're awake sick at night and it seems like the morning will never come, all of that is erased because life is short. But the fact is, when you look at people's lives, it becomes very evident that we're not living by that Bible principle that life is short. We act like we're going to live forever, don't we? And we act like that death is way, way, way down the road if it's ever going to come. When you look at what God said concerning Babylon in Isaiah, through the prophet in Isaiah 47, He says, "And you Babylon, you said, I shall be a lady forever, so that you did not take these things to heart." Babylon had the attitude, especially the king, we're great and we'll always be great. And sometimes we're tempted to have the attitude, I'm young, I'm healthy, life is good, I'm working hard and money's coming in and my family's okay and it's always going to be like this. But it's not. That's not the nature of this life. We're getting older. Things are going to change. And one day we're going to die. We're going to die. Now that may sound like a gloomy message to you. It's not a gloomy message. It's something that must happen. And so we need to pay attention. I want to introduce you to this fella. This is Bob. This is a picture story for you. Bob checked into a hotel, and when he got to his room, he saw that this room really could use a lot of improvement. So his first call was to this fella here. That's Peter. And Peter is in the construction business. And so he said, Peter, I want you to come here. I've got some ideas for my hotel room. So he had him put in shelves. He had him put in a marble countertop in the bathroom, lay some really nice ceramic tile, changed out the carpet, put new lighting, painted, and I mean this room was looking good. But it wasn't quite good enough, and so his next call was to this. That's rooms to go. And he said, I don't like the furniture in my hotel room. I want you guys to come up here. Take all this stuff out. Bring me all new plush leather furniture. So they moved all the new furniture in. And he sat back that evening and he looked at his room and he said, now this is a place that I can live. And then he got up in the morning and checked out. Now you say, that's ridiculous. What kind of a person would do that? Well, before you give Bob too hard a time, remember that there's been times that you were Bob. This life that God gives you, that He tells you is just going to be for a little while. There's been times that I and that you have put way too much into the temporal passing things without thought of the fact that we're going to be leaving soon. And what happens is what Paul talks about in Philippians 3. He says in verse 18, many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who set their minds on earthly things. Now, if you don't think that you've ever set your mind on earthly things, I got a feeling you're just kidding yourself. Because every day we are bombarded by earthly things. It's on our TV and on our radio, and it's on the billboards that we pass by on the highway. And our friends are constantly, and our neighbors are constantly putting their minds on earthly things. And we're tempted every moment of every day to do the same thing. And we'd better watch it. Romans chapter 8 and in verse 5. Romans 8 and verse 5. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. We need to spend time, all the time, thinking about that which lasts forever. We need to make an effort to do that. I was out talking to Nita one day last week, and she brought that up, that when you get in a situation where you're no longer able to be doing the things of the world, all that comes to your mind is the truth of the Bible and what God has said. We need to not wait until we're confined to a bed in a nursing home or till we're confined to the sick bed in our own home to be thinking about that which is eternal. You remember what Theron read for us in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. He said in verse 2, the preacher says, the living will take it to heart. This house of mourning and thinking about the fact that death is the end of all men, the living will take it to heart. We need to take it to heart. The psalmist in Psalm 90 And in verse 12 says, teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. We need to be asking God to help us make every day count. You know, I've had people that I really respected that have told me, more than one person has told me, you need to improve yourself every day. You need to do something every day of your life to make yourself better than you were yesterday. God tells me that. Number your days. Don't let this just be a day to let time go by. Don't be marking time. Just passing the time. Make this a day that has a number. That this is one day out of all the days of your life, and make the most of it. And most of all, ask God to make you wise on this day. The Hebrew writer reminds us that we just get one shot at this, folks. As it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment. So Christ was offered once. Men die once. And so we need to realize that. We need to realize the nature and the reality of death. We don't know when our death is going to happen, and we're powerless to stop it. Do you have to be old to die? No. Young people die all the time. When I was in high school, there was a boy that I went to junior high with, and then we had two high schools. He went to East and I went to North. I was good friends with him when we were in junior high. One day I heard that my friend Tony, he was on the track team at Columbus East. And I got word that during practice for the high jump, he went over the bar, hit the pad awkwardly, bounced off of it onto the hard track, hit his head, and never woke up. He was 16 or 17 years old. He had done that thing hundreds of times. You don't have to be old to die. And you don't have to be doing something really crazy like jumping off a cliff with a parachute to die. You can just be doing the normal, everyday things, and death can come. The wise man said, time and chance happens to us all. In Ecclesiastes 8, and in verse 8, the preacher says, no one has power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit, and no one has power in the day of death. It's one of those things where you just let go. It's not up to you. You can't keep yourself here. You don't have power over that. We need to understand that when we die, we're going to leave everything that we have acquired here behind. That ought to temper our attitude toward acquiring things, shouldn't it? But again, we're bombarded every day with the message, get all you can, buy it up, invest your time and money into this world's goods. But the Bible tells us that is not a wise investment. In Psalm 49 and in verse 17, it talks about the rich man, the one who's acquired many goods. And it says, when he dies, he shall carry how much away? Only half? Only a quarter? Just a tenth? No. He will carry nothing away. His glory shall not descend after him. What's better? A dead rich man or a dead poor man? There's no difference, is there? What's better? A rich man, a dead man, or a dead woman? There's no difference. We need to understand that death is the great equalizer. And all these things that we have acquired, they're going to pass. We're going to, the preacher in Ecclesiastes 5 says, we're going to leave this world just the same way we came into it. Our bank account will be exactly the same. Our clothing will be exactly the same. Our housing, everything that we had when we were born, that's what we're going to leave with. we don't get to take any of it. I heard a story when I was growing up about a man that asked to be buried in his Cadillac, and they dug a hole and put him in his Cadillac and buried him. You think he took it with him? He didn't take anything with him. And the sad thing is that Psalm 39 and in verse 6, surely every man walks about like a shadow. Surely they busy themselves in vain. He heaps up riches and does not know who will gather them. You think about all this time and effort I put into gathering things up my whole life, and then when I die, what power do I have over those things? You say, well, you can leave a will. You can leave it to whoever you want. All right. So I leave it to somebody. Do I have any power over what they do with it? I worked hard with the sweat of my brow to get these things. They may blow it all in one day. We don't have any power at all. And leaving everything means leaving our bodies. And that's why Peter talks about in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 14, our body as a tent. The tent was used to put up and live in and then fold up and move on. Folks, that's what our bodies are. They've been put up for us to live in, but don't be foolish and not realize that we're going to fold them up and move on. That's just what's going to happen. That's the natural progression of things. And so the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, he says, we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. God's got something prepared that's much better than the house that He's given us while we're on this earth. And so he says in verse 4, we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up by life. So we have this desire. We don't have a desire to die. We have a desire to have what we're going to have after we die. And so that death is just a part of that. And so he says in verse 7, we walk by faith, not by sight. We're confident, yes, well pleased rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. And therefore we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to Him. So we need to keep in mind that this body is just for a little while. I wanted to say a couple things about this. A lot of things that I'm saying here, I've only said in funerals, which to me is wasting a lot of good audiences that need to hear this same message. I need to hear this, and you need to, whether we're at a funeral or not. When we die, the body is left behind. What is that body? That body is now an empty shell because, as we just read in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the spirit leaves the body. So since the spirit is no longer a part of that body, it's empty now. And so what we do with that body generally has to do with the customs that are a part of the culture that we live in. In the Old Testament, Numbers 19, Deuteronomy 21, it talks about the fact that the dead body was considered unclean. And God had certain provisions that if you were around a dead body, that you had to go through a particular purification so that you could then enter back into the general population of the camp. And then a dead body and an unburied body was considered a defilement. And so there were laws about, making sure the one who's hung on a tree is not allowed to remain there, but they are buried. And our science now confirms that, a lot of disease and things come from the exposed dead body. And so most cultures understand that needs to be buried. So most most people in the Bible were buried. You can read about Abraham and Sarah in Genesis chapter 50, Genesis chapter 23. At that point, Abraham has his wife Sarah's body. She's no longer inhabiting that body, but he wants to, out of respect and kindness, to bury that body. He has no land to bury it. So he buys land for the specific purpose of burying, as he puts it, I want to bury my dead out of my sight. And that was considered respect for Sarah and a kindness that he was showing. And most of those burials were done quickly, although we have some, with extenuating circumstances, like the body of Jacob in Egypt, who Joseph had it embalmed because it was going to be a while before it would be buried. In Israel, it was considered to a dishonorable person that person was to be burned or cremated. Of course, their cremation wouldn't have been anything like we are able to achieve today, because they didn't have that particular kind of facilities open to them. And so you have Achor and his family in Joshua 7. You have the priests of Baal in 2 Kings 23. Those people were burned, and that at that time was a show of dishonor toward them. But sometimes circumstances arose where cremation was necessary. I don't know if you remember or not, but in 1 Samuel 31, Saul and all his sons and his armor bearer, they all die the same day. And the Philistines, the next day, when they're going around and they're looting all the dead bodies, they come across Saul's body. And they behead him, and they take his body and they fasten it to a wall. Well, when the Israelites of Jabesh Gilead heard about that, the valiant, brave men rode and they got that body, and they brought it, and they burned King Saul's body, and then they buried the bones. And that was a kind of a thing of necessity at the time. Probably putrefaction had already begun, and it was something that had to be done. But there was a time element and speed that needed to be accomplished. And the fact is, eventually, burning apparently became routine at times. In Amos chapter 6 and verse 10, it talks about those who go into the house and get the dead body and burn the body. And it doesn't say anything there about it being a dishonorable person, but just the general public. Whatever happens, we know that whether a person's buried, whether they're cremated, whether they are lost at sea, or whether they fall from one of the towers on 9/11, however a person, the final disposition of their body, we all know, just as the preacher said, will return to the dust, right? Some processes take longer than others for the body to return to dust, but that's what's going to happen one way or the other. And so we need to understand what this body is and why we take care of it while we're alive and why we show kindness to it even when we know the spirit has departed. In the Bible, it constantly shows us that funerals, remembering those who have passed on, that's a time of mourning and a time of grief. But we need to understand, we're not sad for the one that has gone on. You know, it's blessed are the dead that die in the Lord, John says in the Revelation. And those who have departed, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4, we don't sorrow as those who have no hope. So we're not sad for that person that was a God-fearing person who's died. We're not sad for them. We're sad for us. that we're not going to be with them. We're going to miss them. And that's why I think in Acts chapter 8, you read about this great lamentation that's made for Stephen. Not because they're worried about his eternal destiny, but this was a great man and a great God-fearing man that has left us, and we're going to miss him. But there is an exception to that, isn't there? And I'll tell you, that's something that when I get the phone call or someone comes to the house and asks, can you do this funeral for this person who never knew the Lord? I tell you, I hate that. I hate that call. I hate being asked to do that. Because what am I supposed to say? Of course, it doesn't matter what I say. God's going to judge. But what can I offer as hope? I can't preach that person into heaven. I can't preach somebody into hell. But I can't go to the Bible and say, here's your hope. And that is sad indeed. A lot of our customs have a biblical basis. Leaving a will for a person, what you want done as far as burial. We see that Hebrews 11 verse 22 when it talks about Joseph giving command concerning his bones. He didn't want his bones left in Egypt. He knew God would come and bring them to the promised land. He said, when God does that, take my bones with you. We leave direction for what we want done. The prophets talk about great lamentation that was made when a person dies. In Matthew 9 and verse 23, when Jesus enters the house of one who has died, he hears the mourners and he hears the flutes and all the musicians playing the funeral music. And that seems to be something that's carried on to this day. Genesis 50, when Joseph takes his father to be buried, you have this great procession, not only of the Hebrews, but a huge procession of the Egyptians that go with him, so that the people of the land that they passed through, when they saw this, they would say, oh, this is a great lamentation, and look at this great company that is coming through. It made an impression on them. And even the tombstones. You read in Genesis 35 and in 2 Kings 23. Genesis 35 is the tombstone of Rachel. And the Scriptures say it is there to this day when the Scriptures were written. And then in 2 Kings 23, as Josiah has been told by the prophet to go and destroy the high places, he looks and he says, hey, here's a tombstone. Who is this? And he's told, that's the tomb of the prophet that came and gave you these orders. And Josiah says, well, leave that one alone. Don't touch that one. So we even get our tradition of the tombstone. Knowing this, and again, you might say, boy, this was a dreary lesson, John. I don't think so. I think what it is reality and looking at the transition that you and I are going to make. Unless the Lord comes, we're all going to make it. And so in 2 Corinthians 5, what do we need to do? We're well pleased to be absent from the body and present with the Lord. How can you be well pleased to be absent from the body and present with the Lord? When you have faith in God and when you're doing what God has told you to do, you can be well pleased. And so, verse 10, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Once we make that transition, our next stop is the judgment. And so verse 11, knowing therefore the terror of the Lord, we persuade men, but we are well known to God, and I also trust are well known in your consciences. We need to let people know. This is what happens. We've got to be ready. And I hope you're ready today. I hope that you realize that death will come and that death won't scare you. Maybe the death process does. I had a good friend over in Tennessee that died a few years ago, and he was a chemical engineer. And when I went to see him the very last time, he said, I'm not afraid to die, John, but now the process has me a little worried. I understand that. We've never been through it. But we don't have to be afraid of what is on the other side. The Hebrew writer tells us that Jesus destroyed the fear of death. If you don't know Jesus, if you haven't confessed your faith in Jesus and repented and been baptized for the remission of your sins, you need to do that. It throws the fear of death out the window. if you die, things are going to get a lot better. We hope you have that hope. If you don't, and we can help you, please let us know right now while we stand and sing.